Sunday night, or any of you at home who tried this past Wednesday night, or Sunday morning, or Sunday night, to join us virtually through the live stream. No one to blame there except, I guess, me. Last Wednesday night, I sat there and I had that thing running, supposedly, so I thought, the whole time, and it was not live streaming. As soon as we got done, I tried it again and did a little test run with Blake, and it worked just fine. So I don't know, and the light just went red, by the way, Blake. So
we're going again.
We're going again.
We had a
so
mess
I
up
don't
today.
know. I can't figure that
It's
thing
not just
out.
you.
Apparently, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sunday morning, some of y'all saw me messing with it up here, trying to get it ready. I thought I had it ready. It was going. No. And Sunday night, I just didn't even bother. Sorry, not working. So, but Blake's back to save the day. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Almost done with 1 Corinthians chapter 14. We got down through the middle of verse 33. I guess 3 weeks ago now. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 33. And before we go right there again, we're going to back up and just get a little bit of context. We're going to take our context all the way back into chapter 11. And so if you want to kind of flip through there, I'm not going to read anything, but going back into chapter 11, we have Paul telling them that when they partake of the Lord's Supper, that's not even the Lord's Supper that they eat, right? Because it's just kind of every man for himself, right? Some are engorging themselves and gluttonously, apparently, while others are going hungry. There's not an attitude in it of being subject to one another and of taking care of one another and looking out for one another, right? In chapter 12, he then takes that same line of thinking, which really runs through the whole letter, and talks about how the body is designed in such a way that even the parts of the body, just like with our own physical bodies, the parts of the body that are really seem insignificant, they look insignificant, or some of us have ugly toes, right? But if you've ever tried walking without a big toe, how important is a big toe? You ever smashed your big toe? How easy is it to get along when you smash it? Greg rolls his eyes and say it felt like one of those things where Greg's like, "Oh, I've done that." I don't know, but or any of your toes. If you have a toe that's busted, right? It's tough. Now, some of us, you don't want to see our toes. They're not presentable parts, right? But they're still important, aren't they? And the body suffers if that toe is damaged or has to be removed. And so in chapter 12, he's having that conversation with them on the heels of what he talks to them about there in chapter 11 about the Lord's Supper. He says, look, every part of the body is important. And guess what? God has composed the body the way he has composed the body. And so essentially he's saying that to say, well, you don't really matter, or to treat someone else like they don't matter, is to say, God, you don't know what you're doing. That member, that part of the body is insignificant. And then on the heels of that, as he finishes up what we have as chapter 12, he kind of calls their attention to the fact that you need to desire the things that are higher. He goes through a list, higher things. And then he says, I'll show you a still more excellent way. And in chapter 13, we have that chapter where he addresses these other things in the context of love. Basically saying, it doesn't matter what else I'm good at. It doesn't matter if I'm really good at all those things that get a lot of notoriety. The things that impress people. Doesn't matter. If I don't have love, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter whether I'm good at good things. Like if I've got faith so as to move mountains, he says. If there's not love attached to it, or driving it, doesn't matter. It's pointless. In fact, it's just rattling, like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And then that thinking at the end of chapter 13, we know faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And moving into chapter 14, then, he's still continuing with this theme. Why are you doing what you do when you come together? Is it so that you can boast? Is it so that you will be noticed? Is it so that you can show off? Is it so that you can express your prowess in whatever way? Or is it because you are loving and taking care of each other? And so as we've talked through chapter 14 this far, that's our context. And in that vein, having talked a little bit about speaking in tongues versus prophecy, he says, look, the whole speaking in tongues thing, whatever he means by that, doesn't do anybody any good unless somebody reveals that, explains it so that it can benefit the people who are hearing it. And so we come to verse 26 of chapter 14. What then, brothers? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. Remember chapter 8? Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Right? Let all things be done for building up. There is the purpose. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let someone explain. But if there is no one to explain, then let each of them keep silent in church or in the assembly and speak to himself and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be encouraged. And by the way, the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets. You still have control over whether you speak or not. Just because you have this epiphany, revelation, whatever is the case, you still control whether you just blurt it out or whether you wait, and therefore how you say it. And whether you say it with the kind of love and appreciation and encouragement and sense of service and submission to each other that you should have, or whether you're doing it for the wrong reasons. The spirits of prophets are subject to prophets. For God is not a God of confusion, disorder, right? But of peace, of things being right. Remember that peace is not the absence of conflict per se. Peace is things being whole, as they should be. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, the assemblies, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or was it from you that the word of God came? Or are you the only ones it has reached? If anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are a command of the Lord. If anyone does not recognize this, then he's not recognized. So my brothers, earnestly desire to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. Now, in chapter 14, as in some other parts of 1 Corinthians, it's easy to run off and do a topical study or 14 topical studies on different things along the way, right? And that's not our purpose in this class right now. Our purpose in this class is to study 1 Corinthians. There are, of course, some things that we have addressed and have to address. But let's keep our discussion in the context of what does Paul say? What do we know about Paul and Corinth and that conversation? A couple of things. The overall context speaks to things being done in an orderly way, right? I don't know whether that was me or what, but things being done in a way that is whole. And what's the key personal perspective or attribute to that? Whatever your participation is in the assembly, what's the attitude that has to drive it? From what Paul's writing to folks in Corinth. Or what's maybe the attitude that's present in Corinth that's such a problem, and then we'll get to the opposite, which is what he's telling them should be driving them. Huh? Okay, but for an individual, the individual in the assembly, right? In Corinth, they seem to have a problem. Go back to chapter 4. What does he criticize them for in chapter 4? And then he keeps that up throughout. Starts with a B.
It's not about you, it's about everybody.
Not about you, okay? Yeah. They've got a problem of, it's about me, of boasting. That's not the purpose. That's not why we come together. And so what's the opposite that should be driving their attitudes? He's used it a couple of times right here.
The good for all, edification of everybody.
Okay, edification of everybody. What is that? How about when he said in verse 32, what did he say about the spirits of prophets? That they are subject to the prophets. Now, in verse 35 or 6, we have in relation to women, we have another word there. Something about submission, right? We see that? In verse 34, I mean. But do we see the submission, submissive? Okay. Now, here's something that we've got to make sure that we keep in mind and in perspective. Because the idea of submissive, right, feels different to us in English today than the idea of being subject to one another, right? In other words, if I say we should be subject to one another, or we should submit to one another, do those mean the same thing in your mind? No. But this is the same word in Greek. And so our translators don't do us a great service when they use different words at different moments, because it leads us down this line of thinking or this line of thinking, right? In Ephesians chapter 5, a text that we're pretty familiar with, right? Paul writes that we should submit to one another, right? In reverence to Christ, or be subject to one another. It's that same word. Then he goes on to say, wives to your husbands as the Lord, so forth and so on. You can't apply it differently to wives and husbands than to everybody else, since it's coming from be subject to one another. So what does it mean? This is critical to our understanding of this text in general, and in particular the situation in Corinth. In chapter 11, how are they not being subject to one another? They're not waiting for each other, right? They're feasting and others are going hungry. They're not deferring to one another. They're not putting themselves, metaphorically speaking, on the cross right? For the benefit of their brother or sister. Their brother or sister for whom Christ did what? Died on the cross. And if Wes is worth Christ dying on the cross, then isn't Wes worth me being inconvenienced or not getting my way or maybe not getting noticed or whatever else? Well, sure. But this is a mentality that seems to be really lacking in Corinth. Instead, everybody's like, me, look at me. Hey, I know, go back to chapter 8, I know that those idols aren't really idols. And so regardless of how it's going to affect you, man, I'm going in, I'm eating that meat that's just been sacrificed to that idol. I don't care if it bothers you or not, because I'm bigger than that. I have a level of knowledge that you don't have. You're just weak because you don't understand it. That's the mentality that seems to be permeating what's going on in Corinth. So, when we see this concept of submission or being subject, right, you got to understand it's the same word. So we've got to find a meaning there that fits both contexts, right? And what we tend to think about as being submissive does not really fit the context of, me being subject and deferring to Wes or Wes deferring to me, right? So you have to kind of think through that as you look at these things. Yes?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit foreign to us to think of in a worship setting because it's so different. In fact, in class, you implore us to try to get people to say something sometimes, and we still don't. But most of us have probably been in a meeting of some description where somebody's just trying to dominate and to the point where they're willing to just raise their voice, talk louder over other people, and try to make it about them. That's kind of the way I see that. Their worship services have become just stepping over each other, trying to bring attention to themselves.
One-upsmanship and yeah. And so that's the context in which he says, look, if you speak in tongues, okay, great for you. But doesn't do anybody any good unless you can explain. And by the way, if you can explain, then what was the point in you speaking in tongues? Except for you to show off. Right? I mean, that's kind of the line of thinking that he carries along. So that does nobody any good unless somebody can explain what it is that you said. If you have something to say, you have a message from God that you want to share, that's fine. Wait your turn. Right? And along that same context, as we talked about 3 weeks ago, going back into verse 30, if a revelation is made to another sitting there, then let the first one sit down and shut up. Right? Don't just hog the mic. Defer to one another. Right? Give way, yield to one another. That may be a really good way to think about it. Yielding to each other. Okay? So it's in that context we've seen the speaking in tongues and the explaining. We've seen the prophecy, the speaking, just the talking in general. Because it needs to be something that is orderly and not chaotic. Not chaotic. Now in verse 33, how many of you have at the end of verse 33, as in all the churches of the saints, we all have it at the end of verse 33, but how many of you have a period before as in all the churches of the saints, and how many of you have a comma and then the period comes after? Comma period? Of the 4 translations that I'm looking at here, I think only one of them does it comma. The question is, as in all the churches of the saints, where this is what people want to make the question about. So we're going to address this, and then we're going to realize it doesn't matter. People want to say, as in all the churches of the saints, goes with God is a God of, is not a God of confusion, but a God of peace. Right? Something we have to understand. Our manuscripts, right? Ancient manuscripts don't have punctuation. They don't even have spaces between the words, right? There's not, from time to time, there'll be, when there's a major topical change, there'll be a break, an obvious break of a paragraph, a new start, maybe starting with a bigger letter or something like that that shows you, okay, I'm moving to something else. But we can't rely on our manuscripts to know whether that phrase, as in all the churches of the saints, is the end of the previous sentence or the beginning of the next sentence. It's just a choice that we have to make in translation. And that's why some of our translations have it one way, some of them have it the other. Now, does it matter? Is he saying that God is a God of, is he having to reassure them or explain to them that God is a God of confusion? I mean, a God of, is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints? Or is he telling them that everything he's saying in the context about how they should conduct themselves in their assembly is true in all the churches of the saints, in all the assemblies? Right? And if that's the case, then what follows goes with it just as much as what precedes, and I don't see any other way to read it. Wherever you put this, whether you attach it to the end of the previous sentence or whether you attach it to the beginning of the next sentence, it still has the same, ring to it, if you will. Same implications. And what implication is that? Pretty explicit implication. That everything I'm saying here, what? What's that?
It should be in all churches.
This is how it should be. Right? This is how it should be. Okay. The women should keep silent in the church. Anybody have something other than keep silent there? Remain silent, keep silent. They all say that same thing, okay? That word, by the way, we find back in verse 28. It's not used much in the New Testament, but it is back in verse 28. Talking about the one speaking in tongues. If there's nobody to interpret, then don't say it. Right? Keep silent. Okay? But should also be, so women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be what? In submission. Why do we use the word submission there instead of be subject? I wish they'd just use the same word in both cases. Right? We talked about that a minute ago. So how does that differ? If we see it as in submission, that carries with it, for me at least, that connotation of somebody's got their thumb on you. Right? But in the context, what is he talking about? Is he talking about put your thumbs on each other so that, well, who's going to be in, you can't all have your thumbs on each other. Then somebody's not being submissive. That doesn't work. So this is something that is mutual, that has to do with the women, if they are speaking in the assembly. That is something that, in the context of Corinth and Paul, is clearly problematic and is not expressing this being subject to one another. Right? There's no submissiveness there. Are there things that you would like to see, or have you ever been part of a church where there were things that you would like to see happen, that you would like to see done, or you wish that we did this a certain way or that a different way, but you don't ruffle feathers in order to insist on getting things the way you want them. Am I the only one who's ever experienced that? Well, what is that? It's being subject, right? It's deferring. It's realizing that what I want to do, is not the most important thing. It may be that I think this is the way it should be done, and that this would be a much better way for it to be done. And for some of you, quite often, you may be right. I probably am not, but some of you may be right about that a lot of the time. But the folks in chapter 8 who understood that idols were not really gods, and therefore meat sacrificed to them, nothing inherently wrong with eating it. They were right, weren't they? And yet if they took that and insisted on it and caused their brother to stumble as a result, then that which was right became wrong for them. Because it was not about love building up, it was about knowledge puffing up. And so these are contexts from 1 Corinthians that we have to keep in mind. If we want to go, if you want a study over women's roles, there's a time and a place for that, right? Here, what we're dealing with is Corinth. What Paul's dealing with in Corinth. And what he's dealing with in this whole letter. And if we take 3 or 4 verses out of one little piece of this 16-chapter letter and turn it into something else that we want to talk about and take it all kinds of different directions, then we're missing what's going on in the letter. I'm not saying that it's wrong for us to have that conversation, but we've got to keep it in the context of this letter. And he goes on to say, so they should not permit to speak, but should be subject, right? As the law also says. So he's appealing to the law, whether he's appealing to the law of Moses or he's appealing to the legal requirements of their social political context. There's nothing inherently about the language. Your translation may translate the word law there. And I've got 3 translations here that do and one that does not. If your translation is capitalizing the word law there, what are they making it mean? The law of Moses, right? There's nothing there to tell you that. That's a translation choice. I personally am not sure how much the law of Moses would mean to a bunch of Gentiles in Corinth as far as helping them understand what's going on. And so if it's their social political context, then maybe that makes more sense. I don't know. I mean, there's nothing there to push us. Just know that when you see that capital L, that's a decision that's being made as to whether it's the law of Moses or something else. If there's anything who's they, verse 35, the women, right? Women in the assembly, if there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. For it's shameful for a woman to speak in the assembly or in church. Now, this word, surely most of you have heard that word ecclesia, right? Our English word for church, our Spanish word for church actually comes from it, iglesia, ecclesia, right? And we have other words in English, ecclesiastical, those kinds of things. But it just means an assembly. And is used, yes, New Testament, including Paul, use it clearly to speak about the church. But it's also just a good Greek word that refers to assemblies of various kinds, right? And so there is a sense here at least the possibility that when he says, as the law also says, that in their context, women were not permitted to just pipe up and voice their opinions whenever they felt like it, right? In assemblies in general. Now, I do want us to take a step back, though, at what we said about as in all the churches of the saints. Because it's real easy, when we start the conversation where I've been taking it in these few moments, it's easy to get yourself to going down, oh, well, this is just their cultural context. Their laws did not permit the women to speak in their other types of assemblies, and he's saying that holds true for the church as well, right? For their assemblies, because that's what's in keeping with their norms and their customs. Well, what do we do with as in all the churches of the saints then? Well, maybe we got to think about that a little bit more. To Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, in a similar kind of context, Paul says, everywhere. So what do we do with him? And I think verse 36 helps us to stay in our context of folks in Corinth and their attitudes. Attitudes that apparently are not just limited to the men. Right? Attitudes of superiority and boasting that are not just limited to the men. Apparently, some of the women are having this problem as well. Of me, 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 me. I'm going to vocalize, I'm going to say, because I want to be noticed. And he says, verse 36, or was it from you that the word of God came? Or are you the only one that has reached? This isn't about just you, right? Or even y'all. It's bigger than that. And you don't come together to be noticed. So you individually can be noticed by what you're doing. You come together to edify each other. You come together to strengthen each other, to love each other, to defer to each other, to yield to each other and be subject to each other. If anyone thinks that he's a prophet or he's spiritual, then he'd better acknowledge, Paul says, right? Acknowledge that what I'm saying is a command from whom? From the Lord. Remember back in chapter 7, a couple times Paul said, I say, not the Lord. And then he says, the Lord says, not I. And when we talked about some of that in chapter 7, I said, I personally don't care. Right? If Paul says it, that's good enough for me. Even if he says it's him saying it, not the Lord, I'm not going to take my judgment over the Apostle Paul's. Right? And so this kind of harkens back to that for me, where he's saying, this is the Lord, not me. And if you don't recognize this, verse 38, then, I paraphrase, you're nobody. You're not recognized. Right? Now, recognized, known. Anybody have something other than recognized there? Yeah. If he ignores this, doesn't recognize it, he himself will be ignored. I just noticed something. I want to go back and look at something in just a second. I never had. Remember back in chapter 13? Chapter 13 and verse 12. Actually, let's go back to verse 9. We talked about we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the perfect, when the whole, when maturity, whatever comes, right? When completion comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I grew up, right, and I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And the parallel then in verse 12 is now we see in a mirror dimly, right? That's the parts. Then, when our love is whole, right, then I shall what? Know fully, right? Even as I have been fully known. And here we are in chapter 14. If anyone does not know this, is ignorant of this, does not know this, then he is not known, right? He is ignored, not recognized. So, my brothers, earnestly desire to prophesy. That harkens back to the end of chapter 12, right? Seek the greater gifts. Earnestly desire to prophesy. Don't forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. Thoughts? Comments? Discussion? Going once. Going twice. Bev's over there grinning.
I think it goes back to that. It's important to understand that just because you feel like you have a gift at something doesn't mean it has to be done at that time. And I think I get caught up in what can I do instead of sitting back and watching what God is doing in that situation. And it's the latter is way more important in that, especially in the worship service. Is what is God doing in this through us as a body, not what I can show the body. That is meaningless.
Blake and Lonnie, and some of you may have been to places where these things will apply, but I'll ask Blake and Lonnie and Elvira. Do the assemblies in Puerto Plata just the way everything rolls, are there some things that are a little bit different? Sometimes they feel more orderly. Do they always feel more orderly than ours? Sometimes. Huh? Not necessarily, right?
Not even when they start.
Not even, yeah. Yeah. Because orderly, look, our mindset of orderly has to do in part with, look, it's 6:30, it's time. Let's go. You know. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a Christian in Corinth in, say, 50 AD, just to pick a date, right? You set an alarm on your phone so you make sure you leave on time to go to church? Or do you set an alarm on your watch? Or do you even maybe you don't have a digital watch that you can set an alarm on, but you have a wristwatch that has an analog dial on it, so at least you can kind of glance at it every now and then and know that, man, I mean, Paul says we should do everything in an orderly fashion, so we start at 10:30, I got to be there at 10:30. See, we get engrossed in our context sometimes. And we need those kinds of reminders that, look, this message was initially actually intended for a context very different from ours, but applies to our context as well. But if we take it into our context and just think of it in terms of our worldview, we can very easily miss the underpinnings of it. And the underpinnings can be true in any context in which we find ourselves. The underpinnings of, are you waiting for each other? Are you waiting your turn to speak? And then once you've said what you've said, you're quiet and giving other people the opportunity to speak. Are you making sure that that there's food left for the folks who are running late. Even if they didn't get to call you and let you know they're running late because they didn't have cell phones 2,000 years ago, right? We've got to make an effort to get beyond our worldview, right? And see what the text is saying in its context. And then we can bring that responsibly into our context. Yeah.
The most times I've heard that verse quoted to me is when we had sung a song during communion.
Yeah. Let all things be done. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments about chapter 14?
It's kind of interesting, though, how when you take that principle of being subject to one another and you just apply it, how the order part takes care of itself for the most part. It might look a little bit different in cultures and things like that, but there is, like you were saying in the Dominican, the order was different as far as what they felt was organized or ready to go or whatever, but it worked as far as orderly for them, as far as being subject to one another, each person giving their own turn, their own time, and things like that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? We don't have time to dig into 15 right now. Okay? That's the first bell. If we don't have anything else, then next week we will deal with 15. I'm guessing probably 3 more weeks. Certainly by the end of January, to be done with 1 Corinthians. Be thinking. If you have any thoughts on where you want to go from there, Jason has just, or is wrapping up 2 Corinthians on Sunday mornings. He started 1 Corinthians a long time ago, right? 2 Corinthians a long time ago. So we can go on into 2 Corinthians, and by the time we get to stuff that he's done recently, it'll be several weeks in between, or we can do something different. If y'all want me to sit down and shut up and somebody else, teach Wednesday nights, that's fine too. I'm perfectly willing to do that. But be thinking about that over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and visit with me or Blake or one of the other elders about it, and we'll see where we go from there. Thank you.